Hello. Our next step on the vest is to actually put the lining and the fashion fabric together. So this technique that we're about to use is called bag lining. Bag lining is done where you make the garment body and you make a lining version of the garment body and you stitch them together around the edges, which kind of turns it into a bag, and you stitch them right sides together, and then you turn the whole thing right side out, and then you've got finished edges, and you can kind of move on to the next step. It gives us one of our cleanest finishes. That way you don't have to hem those edges, things like that. So bag lining is something we use fairly frequently. The challenge with bag lining is at some point, bag lining hinders some of the alterability issues. So while the bag lining technique is something that the apparel version of this vest will use to close the side seams, we're going to use a flat lining technique to do the side seams, okay? So this point, once we get these two together, what's going to be finished is our bottom front edge, our center front and neck, and our armholes. Okay, so all of those will be finished in this step. So after we do this step, all we have left is to hem the bottom and put the side seams together. So we're very, very close to having a garment here. Okay, so what we want to do first is we're going to lay out our fashion fabric. We want to lay this out nice and flat. So you'll need a fairly good sized surface. And we're going to lay it wrong side down, right side up. And ideally, you're going to want this on a surface where you can have the whole thing laid out. But if you can't, then we'll just work one section at a time, which is what we'll do here, because I need to keep it in the camera shot, right? Okay. So I've got this guy laid out, wrong side down, and right side facing up. Okay, so here's our back, here's our two front pieces. Our lining should look pretty much exactly the same, but made out of the lining. And we're going to lay these on top of each other with the right sides together. So we're going to see the wrong side of the lining once we put this together. And if we've cut and sewn properly, these should pretty much match up. If they're not matching up, then we might have gotten a little off with our cutting or our stitching here and there. But chances are you're not going to be off so drastically that it's going to cause a large problem. And if it does, that means you might have to go back and redo a step or two. So our shoulder seams here should be matching up. And that's where we're going to start. These should essentially just lay flat on top of each other, pretty much exactly the same. All right, so lay it out flat, right sides together. Yes. And now we're going to pin around the armholes, and we're going to pin across the bottom front. Across the bottom front here, come around the corner, pin up the center front, around the neck, and back all the way around to the other side the exact same way, okay? Like I said, I like to start with the side seams. So just like we do when we have to pin our darts or those lines we have to match up, we're going to pin directly through that seam, okay? Through that seam on that side, coming through the seam on this side, and back through. Okay, so we're pinned exactly on that seam. We're going to do that on both sides. That was the armhole side. This is the neck side. They're not quite lined up, so I'll just zhuzh that around. Again, we're pinned right on that seam, okay? We'll do that on the other side seam, shoulder seam rather, as well. And there should be a diagram of how these go together in the vest instructions. They may not talk you through the pinning process, but there's going to be a drawing of how they get laid together and stitched together. So we started at the shoulder seam. Now let's match up our armholes. We have notches, right? So as we know, we match up our notches first. The back of the armhole always has, well, I mean, nothing's a hard, fast rule, but the vast majority of the time, the back side of the armhole has 2 notches, and the front side has 1. So I match my notches. Now I'm matching my corners. Now these curved seams are the same, so we are not going to be clipping them prior to sewing them, but we will clip them after in order to be able to turn it and have it match up. It's another notch to pin. Okay, so I've got my shoulder seam, my notches, and my corners pinned, and now I'm just going to go through and pin the rest of the armhole. And your edges should match up. Like I said, these are matching curves as opposed to our front facing, which were those opposing curves. So this isn't quite like cutting. It's fine to be handling this and moving it as you pin it. I know that we laid it out flat initially. That's just to kind of see how they line up together. So you can kind of hold this as you need to pin it. All right, so that's our arm's eye when it's pinned, okay? I'm going to go ahead and pin this other arm, and then we will do the center, front, and neck. The bottom, front, bottom, center, front, and neck. Now, one of the things, and I hope that, so I've been doing the video tutorials, but I hope that you've also been looking at the pattern instructions, because one of the things about this project is to try to help you understand how patterns and pattern instructions work, okay? So if you look at the tutorials and also look at the pattern instructions, you should see how some of those things line up. Now, I do some things that are a little different than the pattern instructions. But that's part of sewing. You learn the things that work for you, but you should be able to see how the pieces are going together, both from the tutorial and the written instructions. Okay, so now my arms are pinned, and now it's time to do my front and neck. Okay. Now we leave our side seam open. We're going to come down, match our corners. We should match our darts like we did the side seam. Match this corner. So you see we're doing that along the bottom. Then we'll fill in the pins. As many as you need to be comfortable sewing. All right, so that's the bottom edge. Next, we'll get our center front. And the fabric I'm using, it's a little soft, and my fashion fabric is kind of stretched a little. So I'm just kind of encouraging that to go back together. If you're anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch off, you're going to be okay. If you're much more than that, then you may need to get your pattern piece out and you may need to recut a piece, okay? Once again, I've got corners and notches to match. And now I'll fill in the pins in between. Okay, now I've pinned along the bottom edge and up the center front. Now I'm going to come up here to my neck edge. So it's a lower neck in the front, shorter in the back. We've already got our shoulder seams pinned together. All right, so now that's our neck edge. Okay, and now we come down the front on this side. Matching corners and notches. Okay, and then our last step is now we'll pin the bottom on this side. Got that corner. I'll pin my darts. Now, one of the things you want to do is, if you've made the pockets, when you come to pin along this bottom edge, you want to make sure that pocket flap is out of the way, right? So you don't want that to be caught in the seam, and it shouldn't be. It should be short enough, but just to be sure, it's best to kind of fold that out of the way. You will need to be conscious of that when you're sewing, even a little bit more so. Okay, so now I have it pinned all the way across the bottom and up the center front, around the neck, back down the other center front, and across the bottom again. I have my armholes pinned together, the bottom of the back is open, and my side seams are open. Now we will sew these. Start with the bottom center front, or the bottom front, going around center. And this is 5/8 inch seam, construction stitching. So it's the same seam that we've done all the time, and it's going to be slightly curved in some spaces. It's going to be a straight seam in others. But regardless, it's 5/8 the whole way around. When you come to seams and darts, you want to make sure that they lay in the direction that you've pressed them. So that dart was laying this way. This seam is open. So we're going to keep that open as we come across. Now when we come to this corner, if you wanted to draw a 5/8 inch line from on this side and this side, so you just see where the corner is. Again, I've been sewing for a while, so I can kind of eyeball that. Leave my needle down, foot up, turn it, and actually I'm about 1/8 of an inch too short, so I'm just going to take one more stitch. That gets me back on 5/8 when I turn my corner. And I'll keep going. I have another corner here. And I'm kind of feeling underneath to make sure that that's flat under there. Let's get a little focus. Once again, we're coming to a corner. I'm going to get it so when you turn, it's 5/8. And this is a very gradual curve here. Again, we're coming up on a seam, so we've got this seam that's pressed open, top and bottom. So the bottom is where you're going to have to pay a little bit more attention to making sure that stays open. And the reason we like it to be open and flat is because there's less bulk that way. So it just gives you a smoother, flatter finish. Now our curves start to get a little bit sharper coming around that neck edge. Again, making sure my seams stay open and flat. Coming to a corner, pivot again. Feeling it wanting to kind of buck up and pucker a little bit underneath, so I'm trying to just kind of put a little tension there to help keep that from happening. All right, another corner. I've only got one more corner after this. Right, last corner. Keep our seam open. Keep our darts towards center. And now we've come to the end. All right, so now we've stitched it all the way around, bottom edge, center front, neck edge, back down, center front, and across the bottom, okay? Next, we need to do our armholes, okay? If this was a sleeved garment, we could either put the sleeves in at this stage and sew the underarm seam after that, which is kind of a more modern construction technique, or we can do what's called a set-in sleeve, where you make the armhole and you make the sleeve separately, and then you attach the sleeve into the armhole. Because this doesn't have sleeves, we're finishing the armhole off with our bag lining, okay? Again, 5/8, back stitch, and I mean, I kind of have the vest kind of all piled up here because I'm trying to keep it contained for the screen. But what's important is that the part that's going through the machine is flat, okay? Even if all this is bunched up, whatever part's going through the machine needs to be flat, and you don't need to let any of that bunched fabric get caught up under there. Again, make sure our seams on both sides are open. Oh, see, my foot's getting kind of caught under that seam allowance, so I'll just put my needle down, push that seam allowance out of the way, under the foot. All right, come to the end, we back stitch. Oh no. Oh, sad face. Okay, so this is a thing that happens. You see I have stitching here and all of a sudden I don't. It's because I ran out of bobbin thread. Which is why when you're doing a whole garment, it's nice to wind more than one bobbin so that if this happens, you don't have to stop and unthread your machine and rewind one. You can just put the new bobbin in. All right. Okay. Now my side seam is, my shoulder seam is the important kind of marker point, so I'm going to make sure I pin that back. Pin my corner, pin my notch. I'm just going to put in one more pin just because we'll save a little time, and I've been doing this a hot minute. Okay, now if you would like to make sure you have one continuous seam, you can take this out and start over. But what I'm going to do, which is perfectly fine to do, is I'm going to start about a half inch in from where I ran out of bobbin, where the stitching stops. And I'm just going to stitch right on top of that stitching line and back stitch in that space. So then you can just continue on with the seam. You don't have to start the seam over. Unless you want to, just to kind of make sure that it's nice and even and you don't have a little catch or a hitch in your stitching line. Again, that's kind of a stitcher's preference. You may have a draper or a first hand that might direct you in a specific way if that happens, but generally, it's fine to just pick up the seam as long as the new seam gets started exactly on top of the old one. All right. So now I have finished that armhole. All right. Okay, we had 3 sections to stitch. We had the bottom, front, and neck on the front. We've got one armhole, and now here's the other armhole. And whether you sew from the lining side or the fashion fabric side is up to you. And this is the way I pinned it, so this is the way I'm sewing it. It's not going to make an actual difference in the end. It's more important that your seam be consistent and that the fabric is flat together as it goes under the needle and the foot. Again, making sure both those shoulder seams are open as you go under the foot. And in general, the back side is going to sew better because it's the same fabric being sewn to each other. When you have 2 different fabrics, you know, they'll have different pressure points, different stretch points. It's always easier to sew when both fabrics are essentially the same makeup, whatever. All right. So now we have sewn ourselves together. okay? Armholes, center front, armhole, okay? Now before we turn this, you know, we learned with our facing that curves need to be clipped when we turn them, okay? So especially here in the armhole where we've got a pretty sharp curve, it's kind of straight up here, so don't need to do it there. You can if you just want to be consistent. Again, remember, just use as much of the shears as you need. You know, don't try to do a lot and just cut a little, only use the tips. All right, so that's our, go ahead and do the other one. This, I'm using, the thread is contrast on the lining, so it's easier to see on that side, so it might have been easier for me if I had flipped that over. Alright, so now I've clipped my curves in my arm. Now on the, around the center, the bottom and the center front, I have a number of corners as well as some curved areas. So I'll need to clip those as well. As we learned on the welt, we want to cut diagonally across these corners. Okay. All right, so we've clipped diagonally across. You don't want to cut through the stitching. You want to be very careful about that. All right, so there's our corners. Now there's a little bit of curve as we get up here around the neck, so we want to clip that area as well. And if you skip this step, then you're going to end up with a lot of tension in the neck when you turn it, and it's not going to lay flat. And you'll end up with bulk in your corners, which will make them not pretty, okay? All right, right sides together, lay them so they match. Stitch our arm's eye, stitch across the bottom all the way around through the top and the neck and back around down front across the bottom and the second arm's eye. We clip our corners and our curves, and now it's time to turn this guy right side out. And then we're 2 steps from being a vest. So I'm going to reach up through the bottom of the back, through my shoulder seam, and I'm just going to grab the front and pull that through the shoulder seam. Good news is I get to show you this again because there's 2 fronts. Okay, you want to pull that through as much as possible. Okay, so let's go the other side. We're reaching through the bottom, going through that shoulder seam, grabbing the front, and pulling it through the shoulder seam. So what we want to do here, look guys, it looks kind of like a vest. All right, so now I want to take my trusty knitting needle And again, I've got corners, so I can come in through my side seam, come along the bottom here, and you can push most of it out with your finger. Might even be able to get all of it out because it's not a super sharp curve, especially these two up here. But if you wanted to use your, whatever your pointy thing is to really drive that home, you could. Right. So those are our corners on that side. Got to do it over here on this side. Again, be gentle when you do this because you don't want to poke your tool through that corner because you will be sad. Ooh. Did you see that little metal peek through? I almost did it. All right. So now it should look very similar, but it should be a little smaller because we've done a seam allowance. And now with all these raw edges, the raw edges are all finished. So our next step is to iron this. I like to iron from the inside just to make sure I don't get any marks, or some fabrics will react to the iron and the heat by kind of getting shiny or chalky. And a good way to avoid that is to press it from the wrong side or the inside. Now what we want to do is we want to roll these edges out. We don't want them folded up inside themselves, so we want to push so we get that seam edge out as close as possible. Now I was just reaching in to make sure my pocket lining wasn't caught and that it was laying flat. I have to be careful because this iron has some schmutz on it. So I want to make sure that doesn't get stuck on my garment. I've also learned from working with this fabric in this project that it's sensitive to heat, so I need to move fairly quickly because it actually wants to melt. Very high synthetic content. And what would help me with all of this is a press cloth. I've left it over at the pressing table. All right, so come around the front. Let's go up this neck edge. So same thing all the way around. Get those edges rolled out, get those corners nice and sharp and pointed. All right, so now I've pressed my front and bottom, so we've got a nice clean finished edge. Now I need to do the same with my armholes. Now one of the things you really want to be mindful of when we're pressing the arms is when you just lay it out, down here at the corner where it turns the corner, it has a habit of just kind of cutting itself off at an angle. You want to really make sure you get that seam out so you've got a definite curve here. It's not a diagonal, it's the actual curve. So when you press it, you want to press that curve, not just let it fall into that little lazy diagonal it wants to fall into. Now if you don't have an ironing board at home, or you don't want to get up and down and keep going to the ironing board, do not iron on just a plain flat surface. You always want something underneath to protect that surface from the heat. If you don't have, this is an ironing pad that I got. If you don't have that, you can use a folded up, like just bath towel, shower towel. I mean, ideally clean and dry. But you just want some type of barrier between whatever you're, especially if you're on like your dining room table or your family's dining room table. You want to protect that from the heat. So if you don't have an ironing pad, you're not using an ironing board, make sure you've put something down to protect that surface, such as a towel. And towels are good because they absorb the moisture from the steam better than something like sheets. And you don't want just a single layer. You're going to want that at least doubled. I'd probably have it folded in thirds or quarters, because you're protecting it from both the heat and the moisture. And never have an iron the hot side down and walk away from it. Make sure it's up. Now, if you've been working in the costume shop and you've used the industrial iron, you might notice that it is stored, that while we're using it, it does live with the hot side down, but it's on a special, there's a special little like tray that it lives on to do that. Okay, so now we have stitched it together. We've pressed it, right? So now it looks a whole lot like a vest. Okay, so we've got to finish the bottom, and we've got to finish the side seams. So I'm going to show you how to finish the bottom now, and then for the side seams, we're going to have to use the serger. So that's going to be a little new tool, a little new machine, and a new technique for you guys to look at. Okay. Now, for the bottom, the easiest way to do this is we're basically just going to have our kind of fold our vest fronts up together. We're going to bring one side of the back up this way and then the other side that way. So we're kind of just wrapping this inside. We're folding that inside and matching up the bottom. Okay? So the vest is just like in it like a little pouch. Okay? But our side seams are open, so we'll be able to pull it out the side when we're done. So for this, again, you want to make sure the bulk of the vest is kind of hunkered away from that seam. Match up the corners. Match up our darts. If you want to add additional pins from here, you can. I'll put one in the middle here. But it's a nice long straight seam, so it should be relatively easy to navigate. And now we're just going to stitch ourselves a 5/8 inch seam. So what happened there, if you were paying attention, is some of the thread from where the fabric is naturally fraying just got caught on the foot. So it's not compromised my stitch at all. That's still a long straight seam. It was just kind of bunching behind the foot. Now, the first dart was kind of laying flat anyway, so when I get to this dart, I just want to make sure that on top and bottom it's facing towards center as I pressed it. Back stitch. Sew and clip. So now that whole vest is all tucked inside. You just reach into one of the side seams that's still open and just pull that vest back out. And now we've done a bag lining on our center back seam, and so now that's finished. Now if you have a sleeve board or something, you probably could have slid the center back seam over that and pressed it from the inside first before you turned it. But most people don't have them, so I would say just flip it. And then again, you're just rolling that seam out to the edge. My iron is mad, it's getting spitty. All right, and there we go. Now we have the vest is together. We have everything, all edges finished except for the side seams. So all that's left for the requirements for getting the vest done will be doing the side seams, which I will demonstrate in the next video. And then If you want buttonholes and buttons so that you can actually close the vest, I will show you how to do the buttonholes, but buttonholes are extra credit because not everybody has access to those and they are a little bit more advanced. So that is the vest bag lining. Thank you very much.